Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Johnnie Alexander, and I welcome you to Novelists Unwind. My guest today is Erin Bartels, and we're here to talk about her debut novel, We Hope for Better Things. I want to show the cover. Beautiful, beautiful cover. Erin, this is like amazing. I've just started this book, and it's just gripping. But you have taken the traditional time slip story or parallel story, which usually has a past and a present, and you've made three stories. you've got three stories going on instead of just two, which is just incredible. So tell us a little bit about the inspiration behind the story and the three women who are actually the heroines of the
Sure.
story.
Yeah. Well, it didn't start out as a 3-timeline story. It was going to be a 2-timeline story, and it wasn't going to be set in the 1960s and 1860s. I was thinking of it being a present day and a World War II story.
Oh, wow.
So the initial idea was the idea of this box of photographs that need to be returned to somebody, and the person who took the photos, there's some sort of mystery surrounding what happened to them. And somehow it became about a different time period. And I think it became present day in 1960s first.
Okay.
And then as the story was being developed in my mind, I felt like that's really not the whole story. Like there's got to be something that explains why these people are where they are in the 1960s and the present day. So it became a story that's a lot about race relations, and it's set in Detroit. And in the 1960s in Detroit, of course, in the 1967, there were the Detroit riots. And I was just really interested in exploring who these people were and the issues that went on between people in the North regarding race, whether during the Civil War or during the Civil Rights era, because you see a lot of stories about that set in the South. And I hadn't really seen as many set in the North, where there were other things going on other than battles or, fire hoses on people, but there were certainly things going on. And so it became about that. And I was telling it through the eyes of three women in the same family, and they end up in the same house that's been in their family. And I really like stories that have to do with houses. I don't know why. I don't know why that's a thing, but I think people like that. I don't know if it's because we're a really mobile culture and we don't usually stay in a house for generations, that we're kind of intrigued by that.
I always say it too. I just love that whole idea of just, and I wish that had been my family story, and it's absolutely not, but
Yeah. And I think that maybe that's why, like, you wish that you had this sort of ethos surrounding where you live, and really it's just like, well, this was a convenient place to buy it. So there's Elizabeth Balsam in the modern day, and she is a reporter for the Detroit Free Press, and she's working on a big story that involves different angles about the 67 riots and people who were involved. And through her investigation, she kind of gets in trouble and ends up having to leave. Around the same time, this mysterious man comes to her and says, I have this box of photographs and this camera, and I need to get them back to this woman who I think you're related to. And that's the second point of view. So we see her great aunt, Nora. And Nora is in the modern day and in the 1960s story. In the 1960s, she's a young woman. And she also then explains to Elizabeth, as they get to know each other, Mary Balsam's story. And she's the one who's in the 1860s, who is a young woman who her husband leaves to join the Union Army when she's pregnant. And then the other man who works on the farm leaves, and it's just her and a couple other women. And they have to figure out, how do we run this place? And in the meantime, people start coming up from the South, and she becomes a stop on the Underground Railroad.
That was, I was intrigued that you, when I read that the story had something to do with the Underground Railroad too, because I grew up in Ohio, and there's little bits and pieces of
absolutely
history there, right? And I had just recently wrote a novella for Barber and had just a touch of that in there too. And it was, you just I guess being in Ohio, and then I know they're trying to get to Canada, I never really thought about Michigan's role in the Underground
Yeah,
Railroad, but there was still a need, and so they actually
absolutely.
got into Canada. So
Yeah, Michigan and New York, I think, were very involved.
yeah,
Detroit, it's you can see Windsor from Detroit.
yeah.
If you could swim it if it was in decent weather, easily. So that and Port Huron on the other side of Port Huron, which is more in Michigan's thumb, is a city called Sarnia, and it's in Ontario. And both of those places you could easily cross. And Michigan had a lot of people involved in the abolitionist movement in the
Mhm.
1800s. A
Yeah.
lot of people ended up in Michigan who started out in southern states, who were involved in abolition, and so a lot of people are buried here that you wouldn't think, like Sojourner Truth and
Oh,
people of
really?
her
Oh,
nature. Yeah.
wow. Wow.
So cities in southern Michigan like Kalamazoo and Battle Creek and Detroit and Marshall, those are all cities that were very important when it came to home bases for people who were in that movement, and also just moving people to freedom.
Yeah. Oh, that's fascinating. Were there any battles that far north during the Civil
No,
War?
no,
Okay.
there weren't. And that was the other thing that was kind of interesting to me, is what is the experience of the Civil War where there are no battles?
Yeah, yeah.
So what are people doing when just all the men are off? What's going on, and how are they living, and what are they spending their time on? How are they supporting the war when they're not there, and things like that.
Wow. Well, I know you grew up, or you live in Lansing, Michigan. Now,
Yes, I
are
live in
you
Lansing.
native Michigan now?
Unfortunately, I was born in Ohio, which is not a good thing to be when you're in
I
Michigan.
know.
I have nothing against it, but there's a big sports rivalry. So,
There
I
is.
was born in Youngstown, Ohio, and I lived there about 6 months, and then I lived in Indiana for a couple of years, and I got to Michigan when I was 3. So I only really remember Michigan.
Yeah, so
But
it's
I grew up in the Bay City area, which is okay. So everybody in Michigan does this.
right. The
East
stuff.
Michigan. This is where I grew up. I call it the Thumb Pit. That's Big City. And then I went to college over here in Grand Rapids, and now I live in Lansing.
Okay. There
It's
you
down here for people who don't know. But my whole family's from Detroit. And so I really wanted to write a story about Detroit.
go.
That was part of like why I wanted to write this story. I just wanted to write a story about Detroit. Detroit's been through a lot of difficulties.
Yeah.
And, my mother grew up on the west side, and she and I were looking on Google Earth a while back. I said, oh, you can look up addresses and all the places you lived. And as we did that, we saw that most of those places were gone.
Oh,
They'd been torn down
wow.
because they'd been abandoned for so long. And so her school's gone. The hospital she was born in is gone.
Yeah.
The houses she lived in, most of them are gone. So it's just there's a lot of emotion tied to that city for me, because I spent so much time there as a kid visiting relatives, and both in Detroit and in a suburb of Detroit called Bloomfield Hills, where my dad grew up. So I wanted to write a story that took place there, and really loved that city, because a lot of people have a lot of negative things to say about Detroit, and I just love Detroit. It's got a lot of problems. They're working on a lot of those problems, and I really think that there's a bright future for that city.
Oh, that's really cool because I mean you're right. It's just like even when I said this book takes place in Detroit, it's like, oh wow, what a place to set a story. And yet as soon as you're into it, you just Elizabeth, who's again the modern day narrator, you can just see there's a respect and love in the way she talks about Detroit or the way she thinks about Detroit. And so that kind of that comes through
Yeah.
so nicely. And it's like, oh, this is yeah.
Yeah, I think she has a lot of love for that town.
Yeah.
And it's like when you love someone who has problems, and all you want to do is help, but there's only so much you can do. So she wants to do her part, and whether or not it's working out for her, you have to see as you read.
Mm-hmm.
But she does end up kind of outside of the city, and one of the big stories of Detroit is just losing people.
Yeah.
So she's outside of the city at this house for quite some time during the story, and a lot of people moved out and still move out for various reasons. But there are a lot of young people moving into the city, which
Oh,
is
good.
yeah, I hope they stay there.
Yeah, some kind of revitalization going on.
Yeah, yeah.
It's cool. Well, let's talk a little bit about your background, because this is your debut novel, but you've been involved in writing for a really long
Yes.
time. You're a poet, and you used to be is it the managing editor, the features editor of a
Oh,
magazine, right on?
sure, yeah. So I'm part of the Women's Fiction Writers Association, and I was, for a time, the features editor of their publication, Right On, which is just for members.
Mhm.
But before that, long before that, I've been working in publishing since I was 22. And so that's like 17 years now. Yeah, 17 years this month that I've been in publishing. And so I've been working with authors for a really long time. You're one of the authors that I've worked with in my publishing
Really?
journey. Yes. As I've done back cover copy and catalog copy and
You
things
know
like
what?
that.
Your name did sound familiar
Yeah.
to me.
So that's why I know you.
That's why. Yeah.
Yeah. So I've met so many authors over the years, and I've read so many books, being part of that industry, that I think at some point I said, I really need to spend the time that it needs to try to write a book, because I had wanted to write for a really long time. And it's one of those things that you think you're going to do, and then unless you really make a commitment to do it, you're not going to do it.
Yeah.
It's not going to go anywhere. So I did make that commitment. I think in 2009 or 2010, I decided I was going to quit some things that I enjoyed but took up a lot of time, and I was going to use more of my time for writing. And so I've been writing ever since. Although this book, We Hope for Better Things, I didn't actually start working on. I think I had the idea in about 2012, and then in 2013, I spent the entire year researching. And then I started writing in 2014. And then, of course, you revise for years. And then you find an agent, and then you find a publisher. And, it all takes a really long time. But I think with this story especially, it needed to, because it is kind of a complicated story. And it needed a lot of, work and layering and things like that.
And research. I mean, you spend research, and when you're doing, well, especially two different major time periods, sometimes it's not so hard to do research for the contemporary line, but for all the other, and make sure it all.
Yeah. Yeah. And even during the research, you kind of narrow down exactly what you want to say. Sure. At least I did. There were certain things that I researched that were really interesting, but didn't end up really being part of the book. But in doing the research, you find out kind of what you want to say.
That's true. Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, it's really great. I love a couple of the things that these are quotes from you, so I want to I want to get these on here from your press kit, that you want to capture big emotions inherent in small moments and to tackle sprawling issues in specific details. Can you just elaborate on that a little bit? I just love you worded that.
Thank you. I think I've always thought of myself as just a noticer. I notice things. I notice little things, stupid little things. And I assume that everybody notices these things. And then, I talk to my husband, he's like, what are you talking about? Didn't you see that? And so we just notice different things. And I notice little things and little connections. I love noticing connections between different events, and that's one of the reasons I really like history, is because you see, well, this didn't happen in a vacuum. What caused this? Well, a whole bunch of things caused this. What caused those things? And so I like thinking about those big issues in life and those big things that change the course of history, and they all happen to individual people.
That's true.
In their individual lives. And you think about, it's easy to talk about history or about current events even in terms of people groups or generalities, but there are real people involved in all those things. And so that's kind of the detail part of wanting to feel like, or wanting to see what that feels like to this person. What does it feel like to be in this situation, or having to make this choice where there's no good choice, or, that sort of thing.
And that's very good. I mean, when you're developing a character, and you can put them in those situations where, just what you said, there is no good choice, and yet they have to make a decision, and what's it going to be. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's really interesting to me because I
yeah.
live a pretty boring life. You know, it's pretty routine. I don't make a lot of choices. I don't even work outside of the house much, so I don't even
I
have to choose
know.
what to wear. So, I mean, it's a life that doesn't involve a lot of those choices. And so when you imagine what it would be like, that's kind of exciting.
It is. And I think too, there's a poetic sensibility in this because, yeah, again, you're capturing big emotions in small moments, and with poetry, you're wanting to capture these big emotions in very few words, and those words have to be so exact. And I do not pretend to be a poet at all, but early on when I took a creative writing class, that's what we did. We wrote poetry, and
Hmm.
I had like, I don't know, every time I would send poems out, they would take at least one or two to put in the magazine. And at the time, I didn't realize that just wasn't normal.
Uh-huh.
You know what I mean? That
Yeah.
I was actually doing pretty well. They were just little small presses and all this. Like, but then I stopped writing. I don't know. I stopped writing poetry altogether and have not written anything in forever. But I was interested in your, that in your bio it says you're a poet, and then this, and it's just like it goes back to that. It's like that's what the great poets do. They take
Yeah.
these big things and they make them very
Yes.
small.
Those are the things you underline when you're reading,
Yeah,
right? Like this,
yeah.
especially near the end, or even in a short story, people do
Mhm.
that well.
Yeah.
Um, they just have this little twisty punch at the end that encapsulates this big thing in this very little way that you didn't even know you already believed. You know, I love that about good poetry, and I think that when you're learning how to write poetry, for a while you don't know why certain things work and why others are just kind of boring and nobody cares, that like, why is this one accepted and this one not, or
Exactly.
why does this one make people like, ooh, and this one is just kind of like, okay. But it's that thing, it's that
Mhm.
catching that really common emotion that nobody quite knows how to phrase,
Yes.
what they're feeling. So I love it when poets do that.
Yeah, that's really cool. Do you write a lot of poetry still?
I write seasonal poetry. Like in certain seasons, I will write poetry. And I don't know why. I think it's the change of seasons. It just makes me think more poetically. It's not necessarily writing about seasons, although I've done that. But it's, when winter turns to spring,
Mhm.
especially in a place where winter's long,
Yeah.
feel really emotional.
Oh.
Somehow. Um, but I love reading poetry. That's whenever somebody's like, "What's on your nightstand?" I have a lot of poetry books because it's easy to
Yeah.
read poems before bed because you don't
Yeah.
have to get to the end of a
That's
chapter
true.
before you fall asleep. But I mean, there are some really great poets out there who just do a great job catching those moments,
Mhm.
and I really appreciate that. I don't write as much poetry as I'd like. I think I need to get out of the house more so that I have some more experiences that I can push into these poetry moments. But yeah, I think when you get involved in work and family and all this stuff, and you're just completely tied to routine. You're not traveling anywhere. You're not out and about as much. You don't have as much to say.
Yeah,
So
that's
it's something that you have to be careful of and refill your well. And
yeah, yeah. And it's a lot of work. I mean, even just a short poem, it can be
yeah,
a lot of work.
and it's hard to know when it's done, when the
Yes,
work's done
yes,
and
yeah.
it doesn't need any more.
That's true too. That's true
Yeah.
too. Okay, got another quote too, because this is actually, I mean, both of these are like ones that just grabbed me because I feel like they're part of what I try to do too in my writing. And it's just, so, and especially this one even more so. We can't change the past, but we mold our future every day. And that's like, a, it seems to me to be a continuing theme in my stories too. I word it a little bit different. It's like, we can't change the past, but we can make the decisions today to affect our future. That
Right.
we don't have to be defined by our past. We can't change it, but we don't have to be defined by it.
Yeah.
So, what, without giving any spoilers, do one or all three of the women in your story sort of learn this lesson about?
Um, I think I think they all learn the lesson in a way. Maybe one not quite as much as the others. But I think that what's difficult is not only are like we personally tied to our past where we can't forget it and we don't think we should be forgiven or whatever it is. It seems like more and more everyone around us, if you have anything in your past that comes up and surfaces, well, you're about done anymore. You can't ever get rid of that, and you can't ever move past it, and it always taints you in some way. I feel like we live in a really unforgiving culture.
We do.
Really unforgiving, which is ironic because it's also a culture that pretends like everything's fine. You can do whatever you want, but not these things. And you will never be forgiven for these things.
Right. Yeah.
And it's a really rough way to live. And I think people are really worried about making any missteps, especially if you're online. Don't, say anything that could possibly, and everything could be taken the wrong way. And so I think that's why that kind of interests me, that idea that it's hard to forgive ourselves. It's hard to be forgiven. It's hard to keep moving forward. And these women, they find that, there's certain things that you can do to not really necessarily make up for, but atone for, or to ask for forgiveness or to forgive somebody from your past. And then there are things that, as much as you'd like you set into motion a chain of events that you can't undo.
Yeah.
But there are some things that really can't escape. So yeah, I think they go through a variety of those types of things.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm anxious to continue reading. I'm going to show the book again because it's a lovely cover too.
They did a nice job on the cover. It's really nice.
Did you come up with the title?
Well, I did suggest the title. It wasn't the title it came in on. I had a different working title for quite some time, and I knew it wasn't quite right, but I don't remember all of the titles we suggested during titling meetings. But I eventually suggested this one. It's the first half of the City of Detroit's motto.
Yeah.
So it's, we hope for better things, it will rise from the ashes.
Right.
There it is, in Latin and in English. I was just going to put it in Latin, and my editor's like, maybe you should put the translation. And I was like, that's pandering. And she's like, no, it's pretentious, not English. I'm like, you're right, I guess it is. So yeah, to hope for better things, it will rise from the ashes. And that comes from something that a priest named Gabriel Richard penned in 1805 when he burned down. The whole city was gone, except for, stone chimneys and a stone warehouse. So that's just one of many things Detroit has come back from. And so it was just a nice nod to the idea that you can always come back. You can always rise from the ashes. And it fits the story, not just because it's a Detroit story, but I think because with the issue that it's talking about, there's a lot of despondency, and I think we lose sight of hope when we think about all the things that haven't changed. Lots of progress has been made, but lots of progress hasn't been made, and there's a lot of hurting people that are dealing with issues of race and racism and prejudice and bigotry, misogyny, all these different things that people deal with. It's hard to hold on to hope. And I know a lot of people in my life, especially people who don't have a strong faith background, who really don't have a lot of hope. And it kind of breaks my heart.
Yeah, it does. It does.
Yeah.
Well, kind of running out of time, but I want to ask you at least two more questions.
Sure.
Actually, I got three. I've got all kinds of things I want to talk to you about. Well, real quick, a nod to your podcast. Your Face is Crooked. Why is that the name of your podcast?
That's the name of my podcast because I was looking in the mirror one day getting ready, and I was like, wow, my face is really crooked at this point. You know how like your face starts out symmetrical and it slowly changes over time, and you have your good side or your bad side, and they don't match. And if you just like stare straight ahead, you're like, oh my gosh, things are not in line. And then I started writing this stupid little thing, and I wasn't sure what it was going to be. And then I just wrote more and more of them. And I think I had about, 20, 25, and I was like, I don't know what to do with these. They're not really blog posts. And my husband was like, well, why don't you just do a podcast? And I'm like, well, they're only like 2 to 5 minutes long. He's like, that's all right. So yeah, it's a podcast of weird little things, like neurotic things that I think of, or things about me that, how like you have these memories and they're always attached to some weird, embarrassing thing. And you're like, why do I remember this and not like good stuff? So it's kind of exercising those demons, where other people can listen to it and maybe have a laugh and be like, oh yeah, I know what she's talking about.
Oh, that's cute. That is so funny. So just really short little observations.
They're really short. I mean, Monday mornings, they're out there, and they're usually not more than 5 minutes long. A couple of them are a little longer, but yeah.
Oh my gosh, that's cute. Okay. And then I was on your blog, and one of the popular posts that came up was about writing in longhand. And actually, you are the second author I've talked to just within like the last 2 weeks who talked about writing in longhand. Do you truly do that?
I have made very honest attempts at writing a whole thing longhand. And I do write poetry longhand rather than typing. I don't know why. I guess because you always have notebooks with you.
Yes.
And I'll write portions of things longhand because you have a notebook with you, and that's how you write. But I have not finished an entire novel longhand. Although I am now realizing, as I started working on a screenplay, and I realized that I was so caught up in like whether or not it was formatted correctly, because there's a lot of rules about that I was like, I can't do this on a computer. I'm never going to finish this thing. Yeah. So that one I'm working on longhand.
That I think is just really amazing. And it's like, again, because you're the second one, it's like, and I've tried doing that before too in NaNoWriMo, and it didn't really work because you just can't get that many words. I mean, to
right.
do that. But I was like, God, are you trying to tell me something? Should I really be trying to do a longhand story? And I can't with the one that I'm contracted to do right now, but I've got one in the future, and I think I'm going to.
When you're like exploring it, it's easier to do it longhand.
Yeah.
If you're really into it, you can't write fast enough. You can type faster, so it's much easier to do that.
Yeah, but it's like this is kind of interesting. So anyway, that was fun. And then the question that I always ask everybody at the end of the interview, when you're finished with the book, when you finished, we hope for better things, what did you do to unwind?
When I finished writing it?
Yes.
Oh, I wasn't really clear when I was finished writing it. Even when it sold, I didn't celebrate well. I don't celebrate well. I'm always looking at the next thing I need to do and always pushing forward to that next thing. So that's a real, I'm not good at that at all. I do try to take some time away from writing something after I've gone through it a few times and just, binge a TV show or paint or go outside and I paint. I do watercolor and oils. Yeah. Well, I don't know if I'm talented at it, but I do it. It's just one of those things that I've done since I was a kid, and I really enjoy it. And it doesn't involve words, so it's a nice break.
Yeah, I see. I understand that. Wow. Yeah. Well, Erin, thank you so much. Again, Erin Bartels. This is her debut novel. We hope and my bookmark. We hope for better things. 3 women, 3 different time periods, all coming together, and also about Detroit, which is really cool too. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And everybody, welcome back another time. See you next week on Novelists Unwind.